Nestled on a quiet street in Los Angeles, the unassuming mid-century house at Willow Drive seemed to hold a dark secret. It had once been home to James Dean, the Hollywood icon who died tragically in a car crash at the height of his fame. Though decades had passed since his untimely death, strange occurrences inside the house had turned it into a neighborhood legend. Maggie Harper, a young real estate agent eager to make her mark, didn't believe in ghosts. When she was assigned to prepare the house for a private showing, she thought of it as just another listing a piece of Hollywood history with an inflated price tag. But as she stepped through the front door on a late autumn evening, she felt a chill that had nothing to do with the weather. The house was eerily quiet, the kind of quiet that presses against your ears. Dust motes floated in the fading sunlight streaming through the cracked blinds. Maggie flipped the light switch, and the chandelier in the living room flickered erratically before settling into a dim glow. "Faulty wiring," she muttered, dismissing the flickering as an electrical issue. But then, the lights began to pulse, as if they were keeping time with a heartbeat. Maggie shook it off and walked into the kitchen. The air was heavy with an unidentifiable scent, something metallic and faintly sweet, like rusted iron. She opened a window, but the smell remained. As she turned back toward the hallway, she heard a faint but unmistakable sound. Footsteps. "Hello," Maggie called, her voice trembling. No response. Gathering her courage, she moved toward the source of the noise. The footsteps seemed to echo from the master bedroom. She pushed the door open to find an empty room. The large bay window overlooking the backyard was open, though she was certain she had locked it earlier. On the windowsill sat a single cigarette, but still smoldering. Maggie's chest tightened. The house had been unoccupied for years. No one could have been smoking here. Suddenly, a sharp slam echoed through the house. She ran back to the living room, only to find the front door wide open, swinging on its hinges. A cold breeze rushed in, carrying the scent of rain. By now, Maggie was panicking. She called her boyfriend, Ryan, begging him to come over. He arrived within 20 minutes, skeptical but supportive. Together, they scoured the house, checking every room and closet. Nothing seemed out of place. Just as they were about to leave, the lights went out. The house plunged into darkness, and a deep, guttural whisper echoed through the air. "You're not welcome here." Ryan grabbed Maggie's hand, and they bolted for the door. But it wouldn't budge. The knob wouldn't turn, as if an unseen force held it shut. Then, they heard it, the unmistakable roar of an engine. Maggie turned to see headlights blazing in the living room window. The beams were impossibly bright, illuminating every corner of the room. The sound grew deafening, like a car accelerating toward them. Suddenly, the lights vanished, and the door flew open. They stumbled outside, gasping for air. The next day, Maggie quit her job. The house remained unsold, and the real estate agency stopped showing it altogether. Locals began sharing their own stories of seeing shadowy figures in the windows and hearing the roar of a car late at night. Some say James Dean's spirit lingers in the house, trapped in the place he once called home. Others believe it's something darker, a remnant of the curse tied to his infamous Porsche, the car that claimed his life. Whatever the truth, one thing is certain. No one stays in that house for long, and those who dare to enter never leave unchanged. Maggie and Ryan didn't talk much about what happened that night, at least not to each other. Something about revisiting it out loud felt dangerous, as though acknowledging it might invite whatever they had encountered back into their lives. But Maggie couldn't let it go. A week later, she found herself parked outside the house again. She wasn't entirely sure why she had come back: curiosity, perhaps, or a desperate need to rationalize the events. Broad daylight softened the menace of the house. The cracked blinds and peeling paint made it look more tired than terrifying. With trembling hands, she opened the gate and walked up the driveway. A notice on the door caught her eye: property condemned. The agency must have moved quickly to pull it from the market. But the padlock hanging from the front door was broken, the metal twisted unnaturally, as if someone or something had ripped it apart with bare hands. Despite every instinct telling her to leave, Maggie stepped inside. The air was heavier now, thick with that same metallic scent from before. She moved cautiously through the living room, her footsteps echoing unnaturally. On the coffee table sat an old Polaroid camera, the kind you'd expect to see in the 1950s. She didn't remember it being there before. Next to it was a stack of photographs, slightly yellowed with age. Her fingers hovered over the stack, hesitant, but an inexplicable pull urged her to pick them up. The first photo showed the living room as it had once been: sleek furniture, a turntable in the corner, and a young James Dean lounging on the couch, cigarette in hand. Maggie's pulse quickened as she flipped to the next picture. It was the same room, but empty now, the furniture long gone. In the third photo, she froze. It showed her, standing in the exact spot she was now, holding the photos in her hand. Her breath hitched. She whipped around, heart hammering, but there was no one there. Her fingers fumbled as she flipped to the next picture. It showed a figure standing in the doorway behind her, bathed in shadows. The roar of an engine broke the silence, this time closer, louder, and impossibly real. The photograph slipped from her grasp as she ran toward the front door. But when she reached it, the house seemed to stretch, the hallway growing longer with every step she took. The roar followed her, growing louder, and now she could feel its vibrations shaking the walls, the floor beneath her feet trembling. The windows rattled, and the metallic scent intensified, mingling with the acrid stench of burning rubber. A voice, low and rasping, whispered in her ear, "You shouldn't have come back." Maggie turned, her back pressed against the door, to see the shadowy figure from the photograph standing at the end of the hallway. Its form was blurred, as though caught between this world and another. She couldn't make out its face, but she felt its gaze burning into her. Before she could scream, the Polaroid camera on the coffee table clicked. A single photo slid out, and as it developed, she could see the figure moving closer, step by step. The roar of the engine grew deafening, and the last thing she remembered before the world went dark was the sound of screeching tires. Don't forget to subscribe and like if you liked this story. Maggie woke to silence. The roar of the engine was gone, replaced by an oppressive stillness that made her ears ring. She was lying on the hardwood floor of the living room, her limbs heavy, her head pounding. The Polaroid camera was still on the table, but the stack of photos was gone. She pulled herself upright, her knees shaking as she steadied herself against the wall. The sunlight streaming through the window was muted, almost gray, as if the house had swallowed the vibrancy of the world outside. And then she saw it. Scrawled across the living room wall in jagged, blackened marks were the words, "It was never the car." Her breath caught. She stumbled back, her eyes darting around the room. The words pulsed faintly, as though they were alive. Her phone was still in her pocket. She grabbed it, her fingers trembling as she dialed Ryan's number. The call connected, but all she heard was static. Then, faintly, a voice, her own voice, whispering frantically, "Get out, get out, get out." She dropped the phone, panic clawing at her chest. She bolted for the door, and this time it didn't resist. The moment she stepped outside, the air felt lighter, the oppressive weight of the house lifting. But the relief was short-lived. Her car was gone. The driveway was empty, save for faint skid marks leading into the street. Maggie stood there, her heart pounding, scanning the quiet neighborhood. She spotted an elderly man walking his dog down the sidewalk. "Excuse me," she called, rushing toward him. The man stopped, his eyes narrowing as she approached. "You shouldn't be here," he said, his voice tinged with something between fear and pity. "What do you mean? Did you see someone take my car?" Maggie asked, her voice rising. He shook his head. "No one ever stays long in that house. You're lucky to have made it out." Maggie frowned. "What's going on? Do you know what happened here?" The man hesitated, then leaned in, lowering his voice. "It's not about James Dean. That house, it's been wrong since before he lived there. People think it's him because of the car crash, but the stories go back further. Something about the land itself. Dean just brought attention to it." "What do you mean, wrong?" Maggie pressed. He sighed. "The original owner, back in the 30s, they say he was obsessed with something dark. Rituals, symbols carved into the foundation, all kinds of strange stuff. And every tenant since then has either left in terror or never left at all. You're not the first to hear the engine. Her stomach dropped. The engine, what is it? The man's expression darkened. I don't know. Some say it's a warning. Others think it's a lure. Whatever it is, it's tied to the house. You do well to stay away. Maggie turned back to look at the house. The windows now seemed darker, like empty eyes staring back at her. And then, from the shadows of the front doorway, she thought she saw movement, just a flicker, but enough to make her blood run cold. She didn't wait to see more. Without another word to the old man, she started walking, her only thought being to put as much distance between herself and that house as possible. But as she turned the corner, she heard it again. The low, throaty growl of an engine revving somewhere behind her. Maggie froze, her heart thundering in her chest. Slowly, she turned, half expecting to see headlights barreling toward her. Instead, the street was empty. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, startling her. She pulled it out to see a notification. A photo had been saved to her gallery. Hands shaking, she opened it. The image showed her walking down the street, the house looming in the background. And in the second-story window, a figure stood watching her. Maggie didn't stick around to see if it was still there. She broke into a sprint, leaving the neighborhood behind. What she didn't notice was the faint tire tracks that had appeared on the sidewalk behind her, leading straight to where she had stood. Maggie didn't stop running until she reached the nearest coffee shop, her lungs burning and her legs trembling. She collapsed into a chair near the window, struggling to catch her breath. The world outside seemed normal. People walked their dogs, cars passed by, and sunlight streamed onto the pavement. But the unease clung to her, a shadow she couldn't shake. She pulled out her phone, dreading what she might find in her gallery. The photo of her walking down the street was still there, but now there was another one, a picture of her sitting at the coffee shop. Her head whipped around, scanning the faces in the cafe, her heart pounding in her chest. Everyone seemed ordinary students with laptops, a barista making lattes, an older couple sharing a quiet conversation. But somewhere, someone or something was watching. The phone buzzed in her hand again. This time, it was a text from an unknown number. "We see you." She dropped the phone as if it were burning. The text shouldn't have been possible. She'd barely mentioned the house to anyone, and Ryan was the only person who knew she'd been back there. But this wasn't Ryan. The barista called out her name, startling her. She had no memory of ordering anything, but on the counter sat a cup with her name scrawled across it in shaky, jagged handwriting. She approached it cautiously, the smell of burnt coffee filling her nose. Lifting the cup, she froze. Beneath it was a napkin, a message scratched into it with the same uneven script. "It's too late now." Maggie grabbed her phone and left the coffee shop, her mind racing. She needed answer, something, anything, to explain what was happening. Against her better judgment, she called Ryan, desperate to hear a familiar voice. "Ryan," she said the moment he picked up, her voice trembling. "I need your help. Something's not right, and—" But the voice on the other end wasn't Ryan's. It was deeper, slower, almost amused. "You shouldn't have left." The line went dead. Maggie stared at her phone, her hands trembling. She looked around, suddenly aware of how exposed she was on the sidewalk. A car passed by, its windows tinted so dark she couldn't see the driver. It slowed as it approached her, the engine growling low and steady. She turned and began walking quickly, her pulse racing. The car matched her pace. It wasn't until she ducked into a side alley that the car sped off, its tires screeching as it disappeared around the corner. But the sound of the engine lingered, echoing unnaturally as if the alley itself was amplifying it. She leaned against the brick wall, trying to steady herself, when a voice broke the silence. "You can't outrun it." Maggie turned sharply. An older woman with wild, unkempt hair stood at the alley's entrance, her eyes sharp and knowing. She held a cigarette in one hand, the smoke curling around her like mist. "Outrun what?" Maggie asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The woman took a long drag before answering. "The house. Once it's got its hooks in you, there's no getting free. You've seen too much." Maggie's throat tightened. "How do you know about the house?" The woman laughed, a dry, humorless sound. "I used to live there." Maggie's heart sank. "What happened?" The woman's expression darkened. "It doesn't matter. What matters is this. The house chooses its own, and it doesn't let go. You'll think you've left it behind, but it'll follow you. In your dreams, in your reflection, in the quiet moments when you think you're alone. And eventually it'll call you back." Maggie shook her head, tears welling in her eyes. "No, I won't go back." The woman stepped closer, her gaze piercing. "You won't have a choice. When it calls, you'll go." As Maggie backed away, her phone buzzed again. She didn't want to look but couldn't help herself. Another photo had appeared in her gallery. It showed the alley she was standing in, but she wasn't in it. Instead, the photo showed the woman standing alone, staring straight into the camera. Maggie looked up. The alley was empty. Maggie stood frozen, staring at the empty space where the woman had been. Her chest heaved as panic set in. She turned and bolted out of the alley, her footsteps echoing against the brick walls. She didn't stop until she reached her apartment, slamming the door shut behind her and double-locking it. Leaning against the door, she tried to catch her breath. Her phone buzzed again. She didn't want to look, but her trembling hand lifted it anyway. This time, the photo was of her apartment door taken from the hallway outside. Her knees buckled, and she sank to the floor, her mind racing. Asterisk, it can't be here. Can't asterisk, but deep down, she knew it was. The weight, the cold, the metallic tang in the air, it was following her. The lights in her apartment flickered. She scrambled to her feet, backing away from the door. Her living room filled with an oppressive silence, heavy and unnatural. Then, the faint sound of an engine rumbled in the distance, growing louder, closer, until it seemed to echo inside her skull. Maggie grabbed her keys and made for the fire escape, desperate to get out. But as she reached the window, the apartment lights surged to life, blindingly bright. The roar of the engine was deafening now, shaking the walls. She covered her ears, screaming, but it did no good. And then it all stopped. The silence was more terrifying than the noise. Maggie lowered her hands slowly, her heart pounding. Her apartment was still, the lights steady, but the faint scent of burning rubber lingered in the air. Her phone buzzed once more. She didn't want to look, but she couldn't resist. The new photo showed her apartment's living room taken from behind her. A shadow loomed in the corner of the picture, humanoid but distorted, its edges blurred as if it didn't fully belong to this world. A whisper broke the silence, so close it felt like it was inside her ear. "Come back." Maggie spun around, but the room was empty. She stumbled back toward the door, her hands fumbling with the lock. As she pulled it open, she froze. The hallway outside her apartment was no longer the sterile corridor she'd walked through earlier. It was the hallway of James Dean's house. The faded wallpaper, the creaking floorboards, the smell of rain and rust, it was unmistakable. "No," she whispered, shaking her head. "This isn't real." But it was. The oppressive presence pressed down on her, and she felt herself being drawn forward, her feet moving of their own accord. The hallway stretched impossibly long, and at the end, the living room of James Dean's house awaited. The Polaroid camera sat on the coffee table, its lens gleaming in the dim light. As she stepped into the room, the front door slammed shut behind her. The shadows in the corners of the room deepened, shifting and writhing like living things. The camera clicked and a photo slid out. Maggie didn't dare look, but she couldn't stop herself from picking it up. The photo showed her standing in the room. Behind her, the shadowy figure loomed closer than ever. She turned, but the figure was already there. The last thing Maggie saw was its blurred, distorted form rushing toward her, and the roar of the engine filled her ears once more, drowning out her screams. When neighbors reported the strange noises coming from her apartment, police found it empty. Maggie's phone lay on the floor, displaying one final photo. The house at 1462 Willow Drive, its windows glowing faintly in the night. No one ever saw Maggie Harper again. But those who pass by the house sometimes hear the low rumble of an engine and feel the sensation of being watched. The house, it seems, had claimed another. Don't forget to subscribe and like if you liked this story. Any coincidences with real events or characters are accidental.